Does Fire Emblem have good post-game content? In most Fire Emblem games, once you get to the final chapter, then save your progress, two things happen. Either you beat the game, see the credits, and that's it, or you beat the game, then save, and see the epilogue, which gives you the credits scene. This is how the older games handled the player winning. After the Kaga era, the game would flip between things for the player to do after they beat the main campaign on that very same file, ranging from trial maps to skirmishes and end-game exclusive challenges to unlocked story and gameplay features upon a next playthrough. I find it interesting to consider how Fire Emblem's post-game content has changed over the years, and I want to say changed and not evolved because this series has gone back and forth with good and bad post-game content being really fun and cool and good, and also being bad. And once we go through the timeline of all post-game bonus content there is, I'll talk about my favorite ones in the series, as well as my own thoughts and ideas on what the next FE game could do with post-game content. But before we start, a message from today's sponsor, Reverse 1999. Reverse 1999 is a 20th century time travel strategy RPG developed by Blue Pock Games. On the final day of 1999, a catastrophic event known as simply the Storm, causing the flow of time to move backwards, unravels. In this world, natural-born spellcasters called Arcanists and regular humans coexist, but the only Arcanist seemingly immune to the Storm's effects is named Vertin. Reverse 1999's version 1.4, The Prisoner in the Cave, spotlights the new characters 6 and 37, mathematicians who are discovering the truth behind the Storm by use of numbers and calculations, living in the year 2007, defying Vertin's understanding of the phenomenon. New challenges and puzzles for players are also on their way, with Darkness in the Abyss and the Three Doors respectively, alongside others with even more events on top of that. The strategic turn-based RPG gameplay is a fantastic visual experience with a ton of team composition, spells, and skills to tackle all kinds of enemies. This game has incredibly fun character designs you've never seen before. The world building and attention to detail is unreal in this game, making full use of its unique 20th century time-traveling setting, going from the 90s, the 60s to the roaring 20s, paired up with different national and regional accents for its fully voiced characters to fit its locations even more accurately. And this is all packaged with gorgeous artwork and live 2D animation, blending retro and modern aesthetics together to create a stellar visual experience, and frequent content updates to keep players invested. Reverse 1999's version 1.4, The Prisoner in the Cave, is available on iOS, Google Play, and PC. Click the link in the description to download the game and gain up to 80 summons and a guaranteed 6-star character in 30 of them. And thank you Reverse 1999 for sponsoring this video. What is post-game content? After looking up the Google definitions and trying to decide if post-game and end-game content are any different, I've decided that for the purpose of this video, it's the content that unlocks when you've completed the objective of the main story and seeing the credits. And the game says, here is extended content you've just unlocked as a reward. So many forms of this would arise after Kaga left the show. First, we have the trial maps of Binding Blade, once unlocked after completing the main story as well as unlocking hard mode. The former were simply new maps meant to be, well, a trial for the player. Kind of harder than normal, but honestly in my experience not really. They completely existed in a vacuum. You couldn't gain XP from the grind and then save and retry those maps later with stronger units. So it really just kind of existed as a thing to do. However, beyond unlocking hard mode after your first win, you could unlock more trial maps based on the normal and true ending of the game. And finally, the more often you beat the game, the more characters you would unlock to play in the trial maps. There were 5 trial maps that were rewards after completing the game, and there are also 4 promotional event only maps. That is such an interesting subject for Fire Emblem's lost media that I honestly think I'll make my own video about these 4 maps, how people got them back in Japan, and how it's impossible for them to be attained now. It's very interesting, deep Fire Emblem lore that I've learned as I've been doing research for this video, and it's honestly some of the most fascinating lost media I think in the series, which is saying a lot because I know a lot about obscure Fire Emblem facts, but this shit is really interesting to me. Anyway, if you were willing to beat FE6 9 times, you could finally use Guinevere in maps that didn't matter. But she was pretty cool because she was a light sage, as in she was a sage that had an S rank in light. We're going to skip a couple of titles in the timeline and into Path of Radiance, because this game too had trial maps, unlockable characters for those maps, and some extras for your next playthrough. There were 3 more maps, but they were unlocked by linking the GB GBA games up via link cable, which was also a perk of beating the game, being able to unlock new trial maps and view the FE6 to FE8 character art in what seemed like their highest resolution you could find at the time. If you thought beating the game 9 times for Guinevere was obnoxious, try 15 for Ashnard. Beating Path of Radiance unlocked other things, random and or fixed growths mode, new items called bands which when given to anyone changes their growth rates to fit the class of the band's name, and unlocks like the sound room, art gallery, and theater. Much like how the GBA games do it. Again, I've never been a fan of trial maps and the requirements to unlock characters to play, a handful of maps over and over. The effort isn't worth it for me. The post-game twist of using bands in another playthrough did somewhat spruce up the gameplay. Altering growths strategically to roll more favorable stats was actually fun to do, as well as equipping bands themselves. In hindsight, it reminds me of how FE3 and FE5 handled star shards and scrolls as growth modifiers respectively, without the ability to stack them of course. Let's jump back to FE7. The post-game as far as modes go are, more modes. After completing Elliewood normal mode, you can play Hector mode. For other features, you unlock the Link Arena and the Sound Room, the former instantly providing more value than FE6 and FE9, giving the main journey through Hector's point of view, with Hector hard mode being the hardest difficulty in the game, with extra content and chapters to boot. On a similar beat as the same story but with a different perspective, Radiant Dawn had some interesting post-game perks, namely in the form of replay value. Your second playthrough of Radiant Dawn gives you hard mode and the chance to recruit both Peleus and Sephirin alongside some other story changes. There's also unlocking the options to see what gave bonus EXP after each map and to, and I'm not kidding, turn animations off, as in no slow map animations. This was for some reason not a default setting. Between the two though, FE7 still wins out in my opinion. For the DS era, it had no true post-game. As far as new mystery goes, the only post-game content of note was unlocking the Rainbow Potion and Lunatic Reverse difficulty. Awakening opened up Lunatic Plus difficulty after beating Lunatic, but that was about it. Engage fell in a similar camp, only unlocking random growths mode on Maddening upon completion. And Fates had no post-game content of the sort, beyond being able to traverse the world map and continuing like you haven't beaten the game yet. Engage is a funny case, because according to the developers, they were banking on high-level online PvP as a form of post-game content. In an interview, Nakanishi states, "From the very beginning, we had talked about the possibility of communication battles. We thought it would be a waste if the story was the only place where the characters could play an active role, even though each warrior had his or her own personality. The story in this game is basically a linear story, but the characters have various abilities, so we wanted to make the game more challenging. We also wanted to provide opportunities to try out other combinations of characters even after completing the story." So yeah, there's no New Game Plus, just Wi-Fi battles, and we all know how popular that ended up being. The prior game, Three Houses though, had post-game content in the form of New Game Plus, and that shit ruled. I already did a video about it years ago, but it just cannot be understated just how much this mode opens up options for the player. Here's a rundown of what New Game Plus actually did. As far as new game modes unlocked after you beat the game, New Game Plus clears. Number 1, because there's no difficulty unlocks because Maddening mode is unlocked right off the bat. Number 2, it doesn't need to provide stories from a different character's perspective as an unlock because it's already there by default too. And number 3, it preserves your completed save game file and makes use of it. Yes, New Game Plus doesn't provide any extra difficulty. In fact, it makes the game not really that much of a challenge anymore unless you started on a hard mode and want to try Maddening for the first time with a twist, which is very valid. It is in fact what I did. It lets you re-explore the world via another story with ease. It cuts out a lot of the unit and resource progression, giving you the best battalions, shops, stats, and classes you had before, while letting you use your renown to fast-track previous support chains for different battle bonuses and endgame pairings, cutting out the support grind time for your favorite units you want to re-recruit, alongside generally being really helpful for completionists. With these options open to you that lets you even try out new fun build ideas using the groundwork from the playthrough before, it genuinely is a fresh gameplay, story, and character experience. It honestly was really good, and I do hope future games do this, especially if they have big narratives with different perspectives. The last batch of games' post-game content is special, because it's not only preserving your progress on your save file to be used after the story is done, but you can actually level them further. These take post-game content to Fire Emblem's next level. Throughout all of FE8, you had the option to always spend time grinding levels versus monsters in the overworld. While this did contribute to the game's reputation of being extremely easy, it was the basis for its endgame content. After completing the game, you'd first get all the normal GBA unlocks, like in FE7, but you have the Creature campaign, which lets you simply fight on the overworld just like before, but with the added 10-level dungeon that is the Lagdu Ruins. I pronounce it Lagdo, maybe it's Flagdo, I have no idea. The high level area is unlocked after you beat the game and contains new maps filled with monsters, each harder than the next, culminating in a showdown with a bunch of necro dragons. This was a thrilling area in the game when I was younger. I vividly recall grinding this dungeon out on my red GBA SP, frequently breathing a sigh of relief after each successful map. But I also remember having to retreat 7 to 8 maps deep because, to be honest, I was actually scared. For me, these were brutal maps that threw on a ton of threatening monsters your direction, and you couldn't save. In fact, I painfully recall a map where I straight up game overed from all the Medusas petrifying me, having to restart and losing all that save progress because you couldn't save in the first place. So if you got 7 to 8 floors in, got all this loot and EXP, you kept dying and losing your units, and you had to restart, that was it. There was no saving, no nothing, it was curtains for you. This made the drive to complete these floors even greater, and in fact, you do get huge reward for finally completing the ruins. The gold gem selling for 20,000 gold dropped by the boss of the 10th floor, which was awesome because you'd spend a lot of gold trying to prep for a ruins run. Grinding for Leon was also actually worth it simply because it wasn't a demanding task and you got another summoner. He didn't have his broken boss stats, but still, asking a kid to fight through these ruins 3 times instead of beating the entire game 9 or 15 times is a way more acceptable task. This challenge was a blast, an actual real challenge, unlike the game itself being a cakewalk. Now looking back, the enemy units are still kind of easy, but those necro dragons, this final map is still tough. And I'm sure a lot of us have really great memories of finally getting that gold gem and taking out that final necro dragon. Next, Fire Emblem echoes Shadows of Valentia's post-game dungeon, the Thebes Labyrinth, serving as the game's final act, 6. Thebes, like the ruins, was a bona fide post-game dungeon, taking place on the continent of Arcanea, as that's where the lost city of Thebes and its tower is located. Not to get buried in backstory, but this location is a pretty important one in the Arcanea games. A key difference between both dungeons is that the labyrinth has deep lore and story behind it. It serves as the resting place of a new character, Forneus, an alchemist, a person who, the deeper you go down the labyrinth, turns out to be the one who created Risen and Grima. There are a ton of messages left on tablets as you descend deeper in the dungeon, providing more detail as to what happened to him. He was regarded as a famed alchemist, but after the death of his wife, he became obsessed with bringing the dead back to life to serve him and to create a singular, perfect being. The Theban Senate grew concerned with his experiments, so they sent messengers and soldiers to stop him, but they never returned. And so, they decided to seal him inside his workshop through the power of the Sage's Shield, which was made to last until the city crumbled to sand. Placed securely in the cracked wall in the 6th floor of the labyrinth, the heroes, well, take the shield, ignoring the warnings heeded prior. Which sounds like we're directly responsible for Grima's rise and awakening, but hey, this city was bound to crumble anyway. From here on, the tablets are written by Forneus himself, who talked about the death mask and what he calls thanatophages, shelled insects within the mask who hunker down and control the dead bodies. In other words, the Risen. Next, Forneus celebrates being given the blood of a divine dragon by the Senate. This tablet was written long before the Senate grew concerned and lost trust in his work, because it seemed like a good idea at the time to let the famed alchemist do his work. Finally, the last entry reads, "At first it was a tiny thing, but on day 80 I gave it my blood. It grew. Its voice echoes in my head. Dark thoughts, violent thoughts." Mixing his test tube baby dragon Grima's with his own combined both divine and human blood together. It grew and even gained sentience. As we know Grima in Awakening, it can legit talk. The deepest pit of the dungeon, and Forneus' workshop, houses baby Grima, who ends up being the final boss. And so, this dungeon serves as an insanely frigged up lore dump to both the Risen and Grima, which was a shocking twist that literally nobody saw coming, and is so gosh darn cool to think about to this day. As for the difficulty of the dungeon, this was hard. Starting off relatively tame with high-level brigands and arcanists, the deeper you go, the more insane it becomes. Extremely high-level enemies and encounter after encounter after encounter. About halfway in, you start to wonder how deep this dungeon goes, and at least in my experience, I was actively avoiding encounters because of how difficult they were becoming. And this was quite literally a labyrinth. While the deeper levels had a ton of space to explore and treasures to find, there were a lot of dead ends with monsters waiting for you. It was legit scary to go deeper. I recall that first boss too, that fire dragon waiting for you on floor 5, especially because down in the 6th floor you're fighting masks, the zombie soldiers of Forneus' experimentation. And do you remember the Demoses? These things were so obnoxious. And literally every encounter just includes a fire dragon now. Things got way more creepy here too, and of course more and more difficult. It just got unhinged. Honestly, dragons, terrors, masks over and over again. And finally, after all that, Floor 10's final challenge. The creation waiting for you. And just a ton of enemy reinforcements, infinitely by the way, including Vestals, witches, more terrors, and dragons. Grima has expiration, which ignores defense, which brings me back to those necro dragons dealing like plus 30 damage all the time no matter what. Grima has a ton of HP and dragon skin, and even though brutal, your first win over the creation was one to remember. What a time to be alive. I will give Sacred Stones credit over Echoes here though. Beyond just playing through the dungeon again, there's nothing more to do here but use it as a means to grind, where the ruins awarded you with new characters to play. I'd have loved it even more if you were rewarded with multiple completions of Thebes in the form of characters. Beating it once gave you Fernand, twice Berkut, 3 times Rudolph, 4 times Jeddah, that kind of thing. Especially considering all the playable character data from Fernand and Berkut that existed already, that's the one thing that I think would make this even better. Overall though, the ruins and the labyrinth were genuine post-game content and really the only two of their kind, and I really wish more of this kind of high-level post-game stuff would exist in the series. Even though, for example, the ruins have no tie to the narrative, you make your own story the deeper you go and the more fun you have and the more intense the experience becomes. Those are memories that you forge with the hardest content in the game. There's a lot of replay value in having new modes accessed by a game's completion, but we've long moved past locking difficulty behind it. But modes like Hector Hard Mode provide some awesome value. A new perspective from a wildly different character enriches the story and characters even more, especially for Hector Mode because it doubled as the hardest difficulty. I am partial to post-game dungeons though. They are certainly more difficult to do in a linear chapter-by-chapter game with no exploration, because otherwise it's basically less of post-game content and more just the story isn't finished actually. Fire Emblem is certainly trending towards overworld exploration, and in hindsight, Engaged missed their shot with post-game content of some kind. It's clear they intended for the Fel Xenologue to serve as the post-game content, being the hardest maps in the game, without question, but that wasn't even on disc to begin with, and didn't even function like a creature campaign or Thebes. So here's hoping for more post-game dungeons in Fire Emblem's future that aren't split off by DLC. However, if they do have a linear story and they want to have an alternate mode with someone else's perspective, I am all for that too, because I think that just is really, really cool. Not a big fan of trial maps or anything else. But a question for you all now. Which post-game content in the series is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comments below. Also, while you're still here, please stay tuned tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern for episode 3 of the S Rank podcast, hosted by yours truly. Thanks for watching. Deuces.